Okay, so now we can start to talk about this final piece, which are we have different terms for this. Deliberate, sometimes we call it deliberately developmental environment. Sometimes we call it deliberate vertical learning environment, but there's certain design parameters for creating, because it is about creating an environment. So a vertical shift doesn't happen through instruction. It's not to poo-poo instruction, right? Or the various training vehicles that are kind of like instruction, right? But vertical shifts don't happen solely by that. Vertical shift is a much more ecosystemic phenomenon. It happens when we shape a particular kind of learning environment. So this photo of the children, they're doing some sort of science experiment, right? And they have all different kinds of things, and they're sitting outside and they're working together, and someone's taking notes, and there's all kinds of things happening in the environment that provides for not just horizontal learning, but also vertical learning, some kind of shift that happens over time. And so the question then is, what's the nature of such a learning environment? And so we're going to briefly introduce this, right? We'll, in the deep dive, we get much more into it, like actually, what are the mechanics? What are the creative pursuit by which we create such an environment? But this ultimately points back to the notion of a holding environment that comes from Donald Winnicott and Robert Keegan, for those of you who like to geek out on this kind of stuff. And there are three elements of this holding environment. So a holding environment is a deliberately developmental environment that brings about vertical learning. And the first element is psychological support. So there's got to be an element in which people are supported in taking the kinds of risks that are needed for vertical learning to happen. And the second piece is psychological challenge. Notice we use the word psychological, right? Because ultimately this work occurs, you could say, within the psychological domain. And challenge is just that something in us gets stretched, some aspect of our meaning making gets stretched. And we often experience that as stress or anxiety, or sometimes exhilaration, although not often. And then finally, learning tools that are designed specifically to catalyze this thing that we're calling vertical learning. Okay, so let's move on to kind of the second part, or the second dimension, or the second piece of this model, or this framework that's at the kind of the backbone of all of this, which and there are four meta design elements. So this basically extrapolates off of how are we doing, Lisa?
We're doing great, but I just want to invite people to, as you do this next piece, especially to be thinking about, where have you perhaps already experienced an environment that has this element he's talking about? Because undoubtedly, throughout all the various things you've done in your life, you've experienced at least some of these elements, and maybe even all of them. So start to ground them in your own first-person experience.
Absolutely, and that raises an important point, that I wouldn't say that any of this is stuff that we invented. It's more like we observed lots and lots and lots of instances in which vertical learning was happening, whether it was us facilitating it or us, actually
Being
seeing.
in it.
Yeah.
Us being the participants
Yeah,
in it.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so just starting to see what are the patterns, and there's a kind of a pattern language to this. And so ultimately this is about exercising a kind of pattern language that has been around really probably for eons. If you look at the great spiritual traditions and the sanghas, this kind of stuff has always happened, right? Great, spiritual retreats and all have these elements to them. And the first element is what we call heat experiences. And a heat experience is an experience that brings about an uncomfortable sense for somebody or a group that the way in which they're making sense of things isn't going to deliver on what it is that they're dealing with. As you just say that very colloquially, right? There's a phrase often associated with this, which is the term disorienting dilemmas. And this comes from the field of transformative learning. And a disorienting dilemma is simply, it's an internal sense-making dilemma in which we have a very felt sense that the way in which we're making meaning of a given situation is not sufficient for the situation, and yet we're not quite sure what would be. And so we're in this sort of gap, and it feels like a dilemma. And it's oftentimes uncomfortable. So heat experiences, hence the word heat. Okay. Stretch practices. So they're a little bit like heat experiences, except these are practices that we introduce that have the effect of bringing people to a different kind of awareness, or maybe being able to step into a new perspective. Like, for instance, Lisa, I think of the great example of, what was that, the afternoon of day one of coaching agile teams. Some of you may have remember this course that Lisa and Michael Spade and I used to teach, coaching agile teams. And at one point, we invite people to practice what we call level 2 listening. And what happens when people practice this is, at first it feels very strange, but as they practice it, it helps, it introduces a different sort of perspective for them. Suddenly they realize that maybe their habit of wanting to give advice all the time is not necessarily the best thing. And so for many people, that's like an aha. So so that's an example of a stretch practice.
And the stretch practice also is something that you can practice to get better at that thing that you are getting stretched in.
Exactly.
So that's how it's related to a disorienting dilemma. Disorienting dilemma is like, whoa, hang on. Beyond here, I don't know exactly what to do. And a stretch practice is, oh, okay, this is one little way I can start to enter that territory.
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of like building the new frame that the disorienting dilemma is wanting, piece by piece, through the introduction of stretch practices. Yeah. So these are all, these are all of a synthetic whole, right? The next element is the social container. So this works in groups. This is not a one-on-one coaching paradigm. This is a group, in any kind of group situation. And so we want to activate the social container. So a lot of it is about, this is why we want to pay attention to interrelations and the
field.
And the field. We want to be attentive to these things, because those are the things that we're tuning as well, right? And the social container, when the social container is powerfully developmental, or when it facilitates vertical development, it happens, it's a little bit, I hate to use this metaphor, but it comes from this guy named Edgar Schein. And he used to talk about how survivors of prisoner of war camps, they have developed a very close relationship with one another. And it's not to compare vertical facilitation with a prisoner of war camp, but people experience moments of discomfort. And when that happens within a social container, it actually makes it possible for people to experience greater sense of psychological support as they endeavor to engage in psychological challenges. And there are many other things that happen with the social container as well. And then finally, the bigger game, which Lisa alluded to at the very beginning. And the bigger game is really like, there's the thing that we are here to do as a group, but then there's like the bigger game. Like, what's the bigger context that holds what we're doing, that expands the range of commitment into which we might live? So for instance, we invited you all to actually look at what might be an intention that you would hold, something that in a sense holds, that gives a context for what we're doing, that empowers that context, and it has the effect, in a sense, of amplifying all of the other elements here, and all of the elements. My puppy's digging a hole to China here. I don't know if you can see her.
She's in the field.
She's in the
Probably
field.
other people are feeling like that too. Like, can I just turn around so I get comfortable enough to lay back down again, please?
Good. All right. Well, cool. So I'm feeling like I just want to leave it at this for now. And I don't know if we want to, maybe if we have time, maybe for a couple questions or comments on this. Obviously, we're opening up huge swatches here, and we'll get into it a little bit more in the next webinar. And then there'll be other materials that we'll provide. And of course, we go into all of this in great depth in the deep dive. Maybe right now, if there are any questions.
I want to make a comment about how this group is doing.
Yeah,
So
great.
like, as I think about a vertical facilitation lens for this group, there has been a lot of support that has gone on in the chat. Talking specifically about what I'm seeing in the chat, lots of psychological support going on in the chat. There are a couple psychological challenges that have come out in the chat, and people have been so far not interacting with them very much, which makes sense because we don't have yet a really juicy and reliable psychological support aspect in our group. And in these webinars, we probably never will, because the intention is not necessarily to cohere as a group in these webinars, right? But when we get into the deep dive portion, like these sorts of things that are being brought up in chat now, much bigger issues that are very timely, those are the types of things that we can deal with and process as a group and learn at the same time.
Yeah.
So I think there's, I just want to make that point that we're always having to be choiceful about which of these elements are we actually activating. And I think that's, for me, that's the most important thing about the Vertical Facilitator program, is to help people become more conscious of what they're already doing.
Yes. Yes.
Help them become more conscious of the places they're not looking at all, and that creates a limitation not only for them but for the group they're working with, and then what stands in their way of adding those pieces in, because usually there are internal things for all of us that stand in our way for adding in those additional lenses.
Yeah. Thank you for saying all that, because I what I would say for myself and reflecting on all of this is that the biggest challenge is really in the domain of self. So going back to those 5 dials, it really comes back to the self. When I get overly fixated on one of those other 4 dials, there's 9 times out of 10, there's something going on, some inner limitation, something that's hard for me to be with, or somebody says something and I get triggered, and my ability to be present and aware gets kind of like shocked out for some period of time. And so a lot of this is about noticing when we get shocked, when we get triggered, and being able to recover fairly quickly, to bring presence back. Because when we lose presence, there's no presence, right? Without
presence, we don't get presence. I like that, though.
Well, what I meant to say, that's good. That's very good. And what I meant to say is, without awareness, there's no awareness. If we're not aware of the awareness of what's going on, nobody is, right? And then it's like a sailboat, and nobody is managing the sails, and the sailboat will go someplace, and it might actually go where it needs to go, but it'll be surely by accident.
Yeah, good. So remember these like 2 major threads here. One thread is how to design environments for vertical facilitation. That's the stuff Michael has just talked about. And the other is like in the act, in the moment of vertical facilitation, paying attention to those dials. And in the center of all those dials is yourself, which is essentially the main instrument of your craft.